Imagine you find a letter, not in a mailbox, not in an inbox, but buried 6 feet underground, sealed in a container that should have turned to dust 10,000 years ago. The paper is perfect, the ink is fresh, and the language is one no living human has ever spoken. That letter exists, not as one document, not in one place, but scattered across 7 locations on 6 continents, encoded into 7 objects that mainstream archaeology cannot explain, cannot date, and, in some cases, cannot even replicate with modern technology. These are not curiosities, these are not hoaxes, these are keys. 7 keys to a door that someone sealed a very long time ago. Someone who knew, who absolutely knew, that we would eventually be smart enough to find them, but perhaps not yet wise enough to understand what they unlock. Welcome to Forbidden Archaeology. What you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is not science fiction. Every artifact we will examine tonight has been physically handled, scientifically tested, and officially documented. The controversy is not whether these objects exist. The controversy is what they mean. Because if the mainstream explanation is correct, that human civilization began roughly 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, that writing was invented around 3000 BCE, that advanced metallurgy emerged perhaps 4,000 years back, then these 7 artifacts are impossible. They violate the timeline. They break the rules of what we think we know about human development. And here is the question that no official institution has ever answered satisfactorily. If these objects are anomalies, errors, or fakes, why do they keep appearing? Why, across thousands of miles and thousands of years, do they share certain features, certain geometric signatures, certain technological fingerprints that connect them like chapters in a single book? Because that is exactly what they are. Tonight, we open that book.
But first, you need to understand the world these artifacts came from, not the world of 4,000 years ago, not 5,000. We are talking about a civilization so ancient, so thoroughly erased from the geological and archaeological record that its existence was considered mythology until very recently. We are talking about a world before the flood. 17,000 years ago, the last great ice age was ending. Sea levels were rising. Massive floods reshaped every coastline on Earth. Entire land masses vanished beneath the ocean. What thrived on those land masses, what built, what recorded, what understood the universe in ways we are only now beginning to rediscover, was lost. Almost entirely. 7 things survived, and they were left there deliberately, placed in locations that would endure, constructed from materials that could outlast centuries of neglect, encoded with information that would only make sense to a civilization advanced enough to recognize it. That civilization is us. We are the intended recipients of this message, and tonight we begin to read it. Consider what it would take to leave a message that lasts 10,000 years. Consider what you would choose. Paper rots, metal corrodes, wood burns, clay shatters. Even the hardest stone is eventually worn smooth by wind and rain and the indifferent passage of time. But mathematics does not rot. Geometry does not corrode. The ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter does not change in 10,000 years. The orbits of the planets do not shift significantly over human timescales. The properties of electricity remain constant across all known time. If you wanted to leave a message for a future civilization, one you could not speak to, could not write to, could not reach across the chasm of millennia, you would encode it in something universal,
something that any sufficiently advanced intelligence would eventually discover, understand, and recognize as deliberate. You would encode it in the constants of the universe, and that is precisely what was done. The 7 artifacts we are about to examine are not archaeological curiosities. They are not evidence of ancient cleverness or early human ingenuity in the conventional sense. They are precisely engineered transmissions, sent across time in the only language that transcends it, the language of pattern, of number, of the relationships between things. The first key is the oldest, and it was found not in the ruins of a great empire, not in a pyramid or a temple, but in a cave in a landlocked African nation, held in the hand of a man who had no idea that what he was holding would rewrite everything. In 1950, a Belgian geologist named Jean de Heinzelin de Brocourt was excavating the shores of Lake Edward in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. He was working near a site called Ishango, a small, unremarkable stretch of ancient lakeshore that had not been inhabited for thousands of years. He found a bone, specifically a baboon fibula, the slender bone of the lower leg. It was approximately 10 centimeters long. It had been deliberately modified. One end was carved into a sharp point, suggesting it was used as a writing or engraving tool. And it was covered in marks, not random scratches, not decorative patterns, groups, sequences, deliberate numerical notches arranged in a system that de Heinzelin immediately recognized as intentional, but could not fully explain. Here is what the Ishango bone contains and why it has never been adequately explained by mainstream science. The notches are arranged in 3 columns. Each column is divided into groups, and those groups, when analyzed mathematically, reveal something extraordinary. The first column contains the following groups: 11, 13, 17, 19. Stop. Pause right there. If you recognize those numbers, if something in your mind just triggered, it is because those are prime numbers. 4 consecutive prime numbers between 10 and 20, numbers that are divisible only by themselves, and 1, numbers that represent one of the most fundamental and universal concepts in all of mathematics. The second column, 11, 21, 19, 9. These are alternating additions and subtractions that cycle around the number 20, a base 20 mathematical system. The third column, 3, 6, 4, 8, 10, 5, 5, 7. Doublings and halvings, a duplication sequence. This bone was carved at minimum 20,000 years ago. Let that settle. 20,000 years. The oldest known writing system, Sumerian cuneiform, dates to approximately 3,400 BCE, barely 5,500 years ago. We are told that humans before that point were hunter-gatherers, capable of basic tool use, perhaps basic social organization, but not, emphatically not, mathematical reasoning at the level of prime number theory. And yet, here is a 20,000-year-old bone carved by someone who not only counted, but understood the abstract mathematical principle of primality, who used a base 20 system, who understood multiplication and division as operations rather than mere counting. Mainstream archaeology has spent 70 years trying to explain this away. The most common dismissal, the notches, are a lunar calendar, a woman tracking her menstrual cycle, an accounting tool for hunting records. Let us be honest about what that explanation is. It is not a scientific conclusion. It is a narrative choice, one that keeps the Ishango bone within the boundaries of what we are willing to believe about ancient human intelligence. because the alternative is far more confronting. The alternative is that someone 20,000 years ago understood prime numbers, and that person was not primitive, was not guessing, was not stumbling toward mathematics by accident. That person had been taught, and here is where the Ishango bone becomes not just an anomaly, but a key. Because embedded in the third column, in that sequence of 3, 6, 4, 8, 10, 5, 5, 7, mathematicians have identified a pattern that maps directly onto the doubling sequences used in ancient Egyptian multiplication, a mathematical technique that wouldn't be officially invented for another 15,000 years. The same technique, the same underlying logic. 15,000 years apart, two possibilities exist. Either human beings in two completely unrelated historical periods independently arrived at identical mathematical frameworks, a coincidence so astronomically unlikely that it strains credibility to the point of absurdity. Or the Egyptian scribes inherited their mathematics from a tradition so old that the Ishango bone is merely an echo of it, a fragment, a page torn from a much larger textbook, a textbook written by someone who wanted future mathematicians to find it. The shape of the bone matters. Baboon fibula, a deliberate choice. Baboons were sacred animals in ancient Egyptian cosmology, specifically associated with Thoth, the god of mathematics, writing, and cosmic knowledge. The ibis-headed scribe deity who, according to Egyptian tradition, brought the gift of numbers to humanity, not invented by humanity, brought to humanity. From where? There is a dimension to the Ishango bone that receives almost no attention in mainstream discussions, and it is perhaps the most significant. The bone was found in a specific archaeological layer, a layer that dates to a cultural horizon associated with the Ishango people who lived at this lakeside location for thousands of years before a volcanic eruption buried their settlement under ash and rock. That burial is what preserved the bone. The volcanic event that destroyed the Ishango settlement and preserved, under meters of rock, the evidence of their mathematical sophistication occurred approximately 20,000 years ago.
But the cultural layer in which the bone was found suggests continuous habitation going back even further. There may be older bones, older marks, a longer mathematical tradition reaching further into deep prehistory than any single artifact can prove. The Ishango bone may not be the beginning of the story. It may be a middle chapter. And if the tradition of mathematical understanding reaches further back, if 20,000 years ago represents not the dawn, but the continuation of a much older intellectual tradition, then we are dealing with a timeline of human cognitive development that is orders of magnitude longer than mainstream science acknowledges. The bone does not answer that question, but it insists we ask it. And the next artifact, found not in the dark of a cave, but in the dark of an ocean, asks the same question in a different and equally devastating language. In the autumn of 1900, a group of Greek sponge divers were caught in a storm near the island of Antikythera, a small rocky fragment of land between Crete and mainland Greece. They took shelter and, when the storm passed, dove the nearby waters to search for sponges. What they found instead was a Roman-era shipwreck, and among the corroded bronze statues, ceramic amphorae, and fragments of luxury goods, they pulled from the seabed a lump of fused bronze and calcium that looked, at first glance, like a rock. It was not a rock. It was a computer,
not a computer in the modern sense, no electricity, no silicon, no code, but a mechanical computing device of such extraordinary sophistication that when archaeologists and engineers finally understood what they were looking at, the consensus response was simple and uniform. This should not exist. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be known, is a handheld device made of at least 37 interlocking bronze gears contained within a wooden case roughly the size of a shoebox.
When operated via a hand crank on its exterior, it calculated and displayed the positions of the sun and moon, predicted solar and lunar eclipses in a 76-year cycle, tracked the 4-year cycle of the Pan-Hellenic Games, and modeled the irregular orbit of the moon with a sophistication that required understanding the elliptical nature of lunar movement, knowledge that Western science would not independently arrive at until Johannes Kepler in the 17th century CE, 2,000 years later. The mechanism was built approximately 2,100 years ago. That much is agreed upon. What is not agreed upon is how. The gear tolerances inside the Antikythera mechanism, the precision of the teeth, the spacing of the axles, the alignment of the display dials, require manufacturing techniques that we cannot definitively attribute to any known ancient Greek workshop. The gear teeth are cut to a precision of fractions of a millimeter. The differential gear system, a mechanical innovation that allows two gears to spin at different rates, was officially invented in the 16th century CE when Girolamo Cardano described it in his mathematical treatises. The Antikythera mechanism contains a differential gear, 2,000 years before Cardano. Mainstream archaeologists offer the explanation that the mechanism represents a high point of Hellenistic technical achievement, that it was made by craftsmen of extraordinary skill whose workshop tradition was simply lost when Rome absorbed Greek civilization. A dead end, a technical miracle that happened once and was forgotten. This explanation has one fatal problem. Dead ends do not leave infrastructure. When a technology is genuinely invented for the first time, when it emerges from nowhere, there are always traces of development, proto-versions, failed experiments, primitive precursors. The archaeological record of human technology is filled with these developmental sequences. We can trace the evolution of pottery, of metallurgy, of architecture, of writing. Every technology has a learning curve visible in the physical record. The Antikythera mechanism has no precursors. It arrived fully formed, at the highest possible level of sophistication for its material constraints, as if someone sat down with the complete knowledge of what it needed to do and simply built it, not discovered, not developed, remembered. Because here is what no popular account of the Antikythera mechanism ever mentions in full: the inscriptions. The device is covered in Greek text, operating instructions essentially, labels for the dials and displays, and embedded in that text are references to a cosmological tradition, to cycles of time, to astronomical periods that align not with standard Greek astronomical knowledge of 100 BCE, but with Babylonian astronomical records going back a further 500 years, and with Egyptian astronomical traditions going back further still. The mechanism did not originate in Greece. It was assembled in Greece, from knowledge that had been transmitted, perhaps for millennia, through a chain of astronomical schools, mystery traditions, and mathematical priesthoods that stretched in one direction toward Babylon and in another direction toward Egypt and beyond Egypt, toward something older
that has no name in the official historical record. Someone understood the mechanics of the solar system, not approximately, not mythologically, mechanically, precisely, with gear ratios calibrated to the actual orbital periods of celestial bodies. And they built a device to demonstrate that understanding, a device designed not for personal use, but as a teaching instrument, a proof of concept, a demonstration that the knowledge was real, was repeatable, was transmissible. A key, designed to be found by someone who would understand what it meant.
In 2006, a team from University College London and Cardiff University, working with high-resolution X-ray tomography, fully mapped the internal structure of the mechanism for the first time. What they found inside the corroded fragments was more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. The Antikythera mechanism had two faces. The front face displayed the positions of the sun and moon against the zodiac. The back face had two spiral dials, one tracking the 235-month Metonic cycle, the mathematical relationship that explains why lunar phases repeat on a 19-year cycle, and one tracking the 223-month Saros cycle, the cycle that allows prediction of solar and lunar eclipses. But hidden within the gear train connecting these systems, the researchers found something unexpected, a pin and slot mechanism that modeled the variable speed of the moon across its elliptical orbit. This requires knowing that the moon's orbit is elliptical, not circular, not roughly oval, mathematically precisely elliptical, with a calculable eccentricity. Ptolemy, working in Alexandria in the 2nd century CE, described a mathematical model of the moon's variable speed, but he described it as two overlapping circles, an epicycle. He did not understand ellipses. Kepler, in the 17th century, discovered that planetary and lunar orbits are elliptical, not circular, not epicyclic. The Antikythera mechanism, built approximately 100 years before Ptolemy and 1700 years before Kepler, correctly modeled elliptical lunar motion in bronze and brass. Who taught them? The answer is in the chain. The Babylonians, who preserved astronomical records going back to the 2nd millennium BCE, had the raw observational data from which the Metonic and Saros cycles could be derived. The Egyptians, who maintained astronomical priesthoods with unbroken records going back even further, had the cosmological framework. But the understanding of elliptical orbits, the geometric understanding, not just the observational pattern, requires something more than records. It requires a model of gravity. It requires understanding why planets and moons speed up when they are close to the bodies they orbit and slow down when they are far away. That understanding, that the force governing orbital motion varies with distance, producing elliptical rather than circular paths, was not officially formalized until Isaac Newton in the 17th century. Someone understood Newtonian gravity before Newton. Someone encoded that understanding in a bronze mechanism that sat at the bottom of the Aegean Sea for 2,000 years, waiting for a sponge diver to pull it to the surface. The bone does not answer that question, but the next artifact does, and in the most visceral, concrete, electrically verifiable way possible. In 1938, Wilhelm Koenig was sorting through a collection of artifacts in the basement of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad. Koenig was the museum's director, an archaeologist and art historian tasked with cataloging objects that had been excavated from sites around Iraq over the preceding decades. Among the uncatalogued objects, he found a clay jar.
The jar was approximately 14 centimeters tall, sealed at the top with an asphalt stopper. Inside the asphalt stopper, a copper cylinder had been inserted. Inside the copper cylinder, an iron rod was suspended, held in place by the asphalt itself and not touching the copper walls. Koenig recognized immediately what he was looking at. It was a galvanic cell, a battery. The jar had been excavated from a Parthian-era site near the village of Kujut Rabu, outside Baghdad. The Parthian Empire controlled Mesopotamia roughly between 250 BCE and 224 CE, which means this battery, this device for generating electrical current through chemical reaction, was approximately 2,000 years old. Edison, Volta, Galvani.
None of these names were the first. Someone in Mesopotamia 2,000 years ago was generating electricity. Koenig's paper on the subject, published in 1938, was politely dismissed. When experimenters in the 1940s and 1950s replicated the design, filling identical clay jars with grape juice, vinegar, and copper sulfate solution, inserting copper cylinders and iron rods, they generated between 1.5 and 2 volts of electrical current, sustained, stable, enough to power small electrochemical processes. The mainstream response, when it acknowledged the Baghdad battery at all, was to suggest it was used for electroplating, for coating metal objects with thin layers of gold or silver using electrical current, a craft application, decorative, limited, nothing revolutionary. But let us follow that explanation to its logical conclusion. If the Baghdad battery was used for electroplating, then we are acknowledging that someone in 200 BCE understood electrochemistry, understood that a chemical reaction between different metals in an acidic solution would produce a flow of electrons, understood that this flow of electrons could be directed, channeled, to accomplish work. That is not a primitive understanding. That is a sophisticated understanding of one of nature's most fundamental forces. And if that understanding existed 2,000 years ago in Iraq, contained in a clay jar, unremarkable in appearance, uncelebrated in any text we have found, then the question is not, was this battery real? The question is, what else was being powered? Because the Baghdad battery is not unique. Similar devices, jars with copper cylinders and iron rods, consistent with the production of galvanic current, have been found at multiple Mesopotamian sites, not dozens, but enough to suggest this was not an accident of pottery and oxidation. This was a design, a reproducible, intentional design. And there is something else. At the site of Tel Abu Shahrain, the ancient Sumerian city of Eridu, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth, archaeologists have found copper objects that show microscopic traces of electrodeposition, layers of metal applied not by hammering or casting, but by the slow, precise process of galvanic plating. Eridu is old, extraordinarily old. Its occupation layers go back to at least 5,400 BCE, 7,000 years ago. If electroplating was practiced at Eridu, if the galvanic technology of the Baghdad battery is not a Parthian innovation, but an inheritance from Sumerian tradition, then the timeline of electrical knowledge extends back another 5,000 years beyond what even the Baghdad battery suggests. The ancient world was filled with accounts of objects that glowed, of statues that spoke, of temple implements that generated light without flame. These accounts are dismissed as mythology, as the credulous awe of pre-scientific peoples who could not distinguish between wonder
and reality. But what if they were technical descriptions? What if the statues that glowed were electroplated with phosphorescent materials activated by a sustained low-voltage current? What if the speaking mouths of oracular statues were connected to acoustic systems powered by batteries hidden within their pedestals? What if the divine fire that burned perpetually in ancient temples was an electrochemical reaction sustained by a chain of galvanic cells, maintained by a priesthood that understood, not spiritually but technically, how to keep it burning? We are not claiming certainty. We are following the evidence, and the evidence suggests that electricity, the controlled, intentional generation and use of electrical current, was known in the ancient world, not discovered accidentally, known, understood, applied, and then forgotten or suppressed. Here is a detail that almost no documentary about the Baghdad battery ever includes. The asphalt stopper, the material used to seal the clay jar and hold the copper and iron components in place, contains trace amounts of bitumen collected from a specific region of ancient Mesopotamia. Analysis of the bitumen isotopes places its origin at a trade location that was active during the Parthian period, which means the battery was not a random invention. It was assembled from components sourced through an organized supply chain: copper cylinders of specific dimensions, iron rods of specific quality, asphalt from a specific supplier, acid from a specific preparation. Someone was manufacturing these systematically. Someone had a recipe, and recipes imply predecessors, iterations, earlier versions, a lineage of knowledge about how to make this thing, why to make it, what to use it for. The Baghdad battery is not the invention of electricity. It is the final visible artifact of a tradition of electrical knowledge that stretches back into the darkness of prehistory. Mathematics, astronomy, electromagnetism, three of the four fundamental frameworks through which modern physics understands the universe. The fourth, the understanding of gravity, of mass, of the relationship between energy and matter, is what the next artifact encodes, and it was built on such a scale that it cannot be hidden in a museum or locked in a basement. It stands in the desert, visible from orbit, and has done so for 4,000 years, and despite centuries of measurement, study, and the best efforts of the finest engineering minds in human history, we still cannot completely explain how it was built. Because it wasn't built the way we think, it was calculated. You know the Great Pyramid of Giza. You have seen the photographs. You know the statistics. You know that it is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the only one still standing. You know it was built as a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE. You know it is made of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing between 2.5 and 80 tons. You think you know the Great Pyramid. You do not know the Great Pyramid, because the Great Pyramid is not primarily a tomb. It contains no mummy. It contains no treasure. The chambers inside it, the so-called King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber, contained nothing of burial significance when they were first entered in recorded history. They are bare granite rooms connected by shafts and passages that follow geometric relationships so precise they are only now being fully mapped. The Great Pyramid is a machine, not a metaphorical machine, not a machine in the loose poetic sense that some ancient sites are described as machines for worshiping gods. A machine, a device, an instrument built with such mathematical precision that it encodes, in its dimensions, its angles, its proportions, and its geographic positioning, information about the structure of the Earth and the solar system that we did not independently calculate until the modern era. Let us go through the numbers, because the numbers are where the impossible becomes undeniable. The base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, divided by twice its height, yields a value of 3.14159 pi, accurate to 4 decimal places, built in stone 4,500 years ago by people who, according to mainstream history, had no concept of pi as a mathematical constant. The Greek mathematician Archimedes is credited with the first rigorous calculation of pi in approximately 250 BCE, 23 centuries after the Great Pyramid was built. The height of the Great Pyramid, multiplied by 43,200, equals the polar radius of the Earth, 6,356 kilometers, accurate to better than 1%. The base perimeter of the Great Pyramid, multiplied by 43,200, equals the equatorial circumference of the Earth, 40,076 kilometers, accurate to better than 1%. The number 43,200 is not random. It is exactly half the number of seconds in a 24-hour day. It is a number derived from the precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle through which the Earth's rotational axis traces a slow circle through the sky at a rate of 1 degree every 72 years. 72 times 600 equals 43,200. The builders of the Great Pyramid knew the size of the Earth. They knew the rate of precession. They encoded both into a single structure using a scaling factor derived from the relationship between them. This is not coincidence. This is not approximation. This is deliberate, precise, astronomical, and geodetic knowledge encoded into architecture. And it gets deeper. The 3 pyramids of Giza, the Great Pyramid of Khufu, the slightly smaller Pyramid of Khafra, and the much smaller Pyramid of Menkaure are arranged on the Giza Plateau in a specific geometric relationship to each other. In 1989, Belgian engineer Robert Bouval noticed that their arrangement precisely mirrors the 3 stars of Orion's belt, Al-Nitak, Al-Nilam, and Mintaka, not approximately, not suggestively, precisely. The relative sizes of the 3 pyramids match the relative magnitudes of the 3 stars. The slight offset of the smallest pyramid from the alignment of the other 2 matches the slight offset of Mintaka from the alignment of Al-Nitak and Al-Nilam, and the entire arrangement, oriented along the Milky Way as the Nile mirrors the celestial river, corresponds exactly to the position of Orion's belt, not in 2560 BCE, when the pyramids are said to have been built, but in approximately 10,500 BCE, 12,500 years ago, 10,500 BCE. That is the date of the last precession cycle's lowest point, the moment when Orion's belt, in its slow celestial rotation, reached its minimum position on the horizon before beginning its 12,000-year journey back to its current high position. The builders of Giza did not merely build for their own time. They encoded in stone a message that would only be fully readable at a specific moment in the future. Our moment, the 21st century, when the combination of astronomical software, satellite measurement, and mathematical analysis makes the full geometry of Giza legible for the first time. They built a clock, and the clock is pointing. But there is one more layer, one more geometric secret that makes the Great Pyramid not just a monument, but a key to the entire network. The Great Pyramid sits at a specific latitude, 29 degrees, 58 minutes, 51 seconds north. This is almost, but not exactly, 30 degrees north. Close enough that for centuries, scholars assumed it was built at 30 degrees and simply wasn't perfectly placed. But the pyramid is not imprecisely placed. The pyramid is precisely placed at exactly the latitude where the ratio between its height and its base perimeter yields the most accurate possible encoding of both pi and the Earth's dimensions, simultaneously. At 30 degrees exactly, the encoding would be less accurate. At 29 degrees, 58 minutes, 51 seconds, the precise latitude of the Great Pyramid, the mathematical encoding is optimal. This is not an error. This is precision beyond what we have given the builders credit for. They knew, to the arc minute, to the arc second, where to place the structure, and that placement, extended as a line of latitude around the globe, intersects with a remarkable series of other ancient sites, including a site in the Zagros Mountains of Iran that was only discovered in 2008, and that shows evidence of human habitation going back 18,000 years. The coordinate system is real, and the clock is pointing to a chamber beneath the Sphinx that we have not yet been permitted to open. In 1898, a small wooden object was found in the tomb of Padi Imen in Saqqara, Egypt. It was catalogued as object number 6347 in the Cairo Museum, labeled simply as a wooden bird model, and placed in storage.
It sat there, forgotten, for 73 years. In 1969, Egyptologist Khalil Messiha was reviewing a collection of bird and animal figurines from the museum's archives. When he came across Object 6347, he stopped. It was not a bird, or rather, it was not only a bird. The Saqqara bird, as it has come to be known, is a small carved wooden figure approximately 14 centimeters long, weighing 39 grams. It is made from sycamore wood, and while it superficially resembles a bird, Messiha immediately recognized several features that no bird and no conventional Egyptian art object has ever possessed. The wings are flat, not curved like decorative wings. Flat, with a slight dihedral angle, angled slightly upward from the center line of the body. This is the configuration of a modern fixed-wing aircraft. It is the geometric property that provides aerodynamic stability in flight. The body is tapered, wide at the front, narrowing toward the tail, streamlined, not like a bird's body, which is heaviest at the breast, like a fuselage, most significantly, the tail. Real birds do not have vertical tail fins. Real birds steer with their bodies, their wings, their tail feathers. The Saqqara bird has a vertical stabilizer, a flat fin projecting upward from the rear of the body at a 90-degree angle to the wings. This is not ornithology. This is aeronautical engineering. A vertical stabilizer prevents yaw, unwanted rotation around the vertical axis. In a fixed-wing aircraft, it is a fundamental component of every airplane ever built. Without it, aircraft become uncontrollable. With it, they fly straight. When aeronautics expert Simon Sanderson modeled the Saqqara bird in a wind tunnel in 2006, the results were unambiguous. The object generates lift. At the correct angle of attack, with the correct airspeed, it flies, sustainably, stably, with the characteristics not of a thrown toy, but of a scale model of a functioning glider. Mainstream archaeology's response was predictable. It's a weather vane, a ceremonial object, a child's toy, an accidentally aerodynamic ornament. Let us examine that explanation.
A weather vane requires a pivot point. It must be balanced to rotate freely in the wind. The Saqqara bird has no pivot point and is not balanced for rotation. It is balanced for horizontal stability. A ceremonial object shaped like a bird would be shaped like a bird. Egyptian art was extraordinarily precise in its zoological representation. Egyptian artists knew exactly what birds looked like. There are thousands of beautifully accurate bird depictions in Egyptian art. The Saqqara bird looks nothing like any bird species native to Egypt or anywhere else. A child's toy. That explanation deserves no serious engagement. What the Saqqara bird is, what the evidence demands we consider, is a scale model, a demonstration, a teaching object, and it was found in a tomb, not just any tomb, the tomb of Padi Imen, a name that translates from ancient Egyptian as the gift of Imen. Imen, or Amun, was the hidden god, the god of concealed things, of secret knowledge, of the invisible force that makes things possible without being seen. Wind, lift, the invisible principle that allows heavier than air objects to rise. Padi Imen was a priest, and in his tomb, along with the standard equipment for the afterlife, he was buried with a scale model of a flying machine. The temple reliefs at Dendera, the Hathor temple complex in Upper Egypt, contain a series of carvings in a lower chamber that have been the subject of intense debate for decades. In these reliefs, what appear to be large bulbous objects are shown being held aloft by human figures connected by cables to what some researchers interpret as electrical insulators, components consistent with high-voltage discharge devices. Some call these the Dendera light bulbs. Mainstream Egyptologists identify them as lotus flowers with serpents emerging, symbolic religious imagery. But when the objects in the Dendera reliefs are compared to the basic geometry of a Crookes tube, a glass vacuum tube that generates light when high voltage is applied, the similarity is not casual. The bulbous shape, the tapering neck, the filament-like objects suspended inside, these features match. The Baghdad battery generates electrical current. The Dendera reliefs may depict what that current was used to power. And if a culture that possessed electrical technology also possessed knowledge of aerodynamics, if the Saqqara bird represents a real technology that actually flew over ancient Egypt, then we need to reconsider everything we think we know about ancient Egyptian civilization. There is a hieroglyphic text from the New Kingdom period, carved in the temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, that describes in language which mainstream Egyptology renders as mythological, a bark of millions of years that travels across the sky faster than a hawk, a vessel that carries passengers, that requires the breath of heaven to fly, that can descend and ascend at will. We read this as mythology because our paradigm tells us it must be mythology. But if the paradigm is wrong, if there was, in the deep past, knowledge of controlled flight, then the temple text is not mythology. It is a history. And the Saqqara bird is the engineering drawing. Here is the crucial question: where did this knowledge come from? The Antikythera mechanism told us someone understood the mechanics of the cosmos. The Baghdad battery told us someone understood electromagnetism. The Great Pyramid told us someone understood the size and shape of the earth with impossible precision. Now the Saqqara bird tells us someone understood aerodynamics. These are not separate mysteries. They are connected chapters. And the sixth artifact is where those chapters converge. The Nazca Desert of southern Peru is one of the driest places on Earth. The climate is so stable the winds so predictable that markings made in the surface soil have remained essentially unchanged for 2,000 years, or, depending on how you date the oldest of them, for considerably longer. From the ground, the Nazca lines are nearly invisible. At ground level, you see only shallow trenches in the reddish desert floor, lines that stretch to the horizon, that turn and intersect and overlap in patterns that seem random, purposeless. For centuries, the people of the region walked over them without understanding what they were. From the air, everything changes. From altitude, from a height that was, according to mainstream archaeology, unattainable in the ancient world, the Nazca lines resolve into images of breathtaking scale and precision. A condor with a wingspan of 130 meters, a spider 45 meters across, a hummingbird that stretches 93 meters from wingtip to wingtip, a monkey, an astronaut, a tree, a whale, hundreds of geometric shapes, perfect spirals, perfect triangles, perfectly straight lines that run for kilometers across the desert floor without deviating, without wavering, without the slightest error. Lines that travel over hills, through valleys, maintaining their direction with a precision that, according to surveying experts, would be difficult to achieve even with modern equipment. The official explanation, the one taught in schools, the one presented in mainstream documentaries, is that the Nazca lines were made by the Nazca people as offerings to the gods. Religious art, astronomical calendars, messages to sky deities. The Nazca people, who flourished from roughly 100 BCE to 800 CE, were the creators. This may be partially true. The Nazca people may have made some of the lines. But the oldest layers of the Nazca geoglyphs, identified through soil analysis and the residue of materials that weather at different rates, predate the Nazca culture by centuries, if not millennia. The geometric lines of Nazca, not the animal figures, but the hundreds of perfectly straight lines and angles that underlie and intersect the entire plateau, form a coherent geometric system. When the straight lines of the Nazca Plateau are extended, when they are projected using modern mapping software beyond the borders of the plateau and across the surface of the globe, they do not go nowhere. They go somewhere specific. The Nazca lines, when extended as great circle routes across the Earth's surface, pass through a remarkable number of ancient sites: Giza, Stonehenge, the temples of Angkor Wat, the Easter Island statues, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the megalithic temples of Malta, not approximately, not within a few degrees of error, precisely. The geometric angles of the Nazca lines, when treated as vectors on a spherical surface, form a network, a global network, a grid of coordinates that connects ancient sites on every inhabited continent. This is not a theory. This is a measurable geometric fact, which means one of two things. Either the ancient builders of Giza, Stonehenge, Angkor Wat, Easter Island, and Nazca independently chose to build their monuments at the specific locations that would coincidentally form a mathematically precise global geometric network, a coincidence so improbable it is effectively impossible. Or they knew. They knew where each site was. They knew the precise coordinates of every location in this network. They built deliberately, in coordination, as part of a global project, one so large and so long-term that its full scope could only be appreciated by a civilization with global maps, satellite-level geographic knowledge, and the ability to communicate across oceanic distances, a civilization that should not have existed.
But did. The Nazca lines contain one more secret, one that the animal geoglyphs, the condor, the spider, the hummingbird, encode. The spider of Nazca is not just a spider, it is a specific species, Rhicinulae, an arachnid found only in the deep Amazon rainforest, hundreds of kilometers from the Nazca Plateau. The Nazca people did not encounter this spider, could not have encountered it. It was known in its precise anatomical detail by someone who had traveled through the Amazon, who had cataloged its species, who had chosen it deliberately as a marker. The hummingbird of Nazca corresponds to a species found only in a specific subregion of the Andes. The whale corresponds to a specific cetacean species whose range is limited to the Pacific coast. These are not decorations, they are a map key. Each animal placed at a specific coordinate marks a biome, a geographic region, a point in the network. The Nazca lines are not a message to the gods, they are a message from the mapmakers. And the seventh artifact, the final key, is where the map was drawn, where the whole project began, where the civilization that left these 7 keys lived, flourished, and was destroyed, in a place that we can now locate, that we can name, that sits still beneath 40 meters of ocean, and it should not exist. In December 2000, the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India was conducting a routine pollution survey of the Gulf of Khambat, a body of water on the northwestern coast of India in the state of Gujarat. They were using sonar, and the sonar returned data that made no sense. At a depth of approximately 40 meters, beneath 40 meters of warm, silted ocean water, the sonar was detecting regular geometric shapes, straight lines, right angles, repeating rectangular patterns that extended across an area of approximately 9 kilometers. The ocean floor in the Gulf of Khambat is not known for geometric rock formations. The geology does not produce right angles. These were structures, walls, floors, the grid pattern of streets and buildings. The Indian government authorized a full investigation. Divers recovered material from the site. Marine archaeologists analyzed the finds. What they announced in January 2002 stunned the archaeological world and was subsequently, systematically, and almost completely ignored by Western mainstream science. The Gulf of Khambat site showed evidence of urban habitation, structures consistent with planned settlement, not the random clustering of natural geology, but the deliberate grid of human construction. Recovered artifacts included pieces of wood, pottery, and carved stone. The wood, tested by India's National Geophysical Research Institute using carbon-14 dating, returned an age of approximately 9,500 years, 9,500 years old. Let that land. The oldest accepted urban civilization on Earth, the cities of Mesopotamia, the earliest settlements of the Indus Valley, date to approximately 5,500 to 6,000 years ago. The city beneath the Gulf of Khambat is nearly 4,000 years older than anything in the official record. It predates Mesopotamia, it predates Egypt, it predates every civilization whose name appears in your history textbook by thousands of years. 9,500 years ago, the Gulf of Khambat was dry land. Sea levels at the end of the last ice age were 60 to 100 meters lower than today. The gradual rise of the oceans over the following millennia, as the glaciers melted and the seas expanded, slowly, then suddenly, then catastrophically, submerged the coastlines of every continent on Earth. Entire civilizations along those coastlines would have been destroyed, not by war,
not by famine, not by political collapse, by the sea. The Gulf of Khambhat site, if real, if properly interpreted, is not a village. The scale of the geometric structures, the density of the sonar data, the geographic extent of the site suggest a city of significant size. A city that, in its heyday, may have housed tens of thousands of people. But here is what transforms this site from archaeological mystery into the seventh and final key: Gujarat. The ancient Indian texts, the Vedas, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, speak of a great civilization of the distant past, a civilization of advanced technology and divine knowledge, a civilization that was destroyed by a great flood sent by the gods. These texts call that civilization by a name: Dwaraka, the mythological city of Lord Krishna, the city that, according to Hindu tradition, was swallowed by the sea at the end of the Age of Heroes. In 2002, marine archaeologist S.R. Rao announced that his team had previously found in the waters directly off the coast of Dwarka, the modern city in Gujarat, the ruins of a submerged city dating to approximately 1500 BCE, the official Dwaraka. But the Gulf of Khambhat site is not near modern Dwarka. It is deeper, older, larger. What if Rao found the later city, the rebuilt city, while the original, the one the texts remember as the pinnacle of divine civilization, lies further out, deeper down? What if the Gulf of Khambhat is the source, the mathematical knowledge encoded in the Ishango bone, carried north to Egypt, preserved in a baboon's leg for 20 millennia? The astronomical computation demonstrated by the Antikythera mechanism, transmitted west through Babylon to Greece, reproduced in bronze by craftsmen who barely understood what they were copying. The electrical technology of the Baghdad battery passed through a chain of initiates and priests who kept the flame alive without understanding its source. The geodetic precision of the Great Pyramid, a monument to the size of the earth built by people who had been given the measurements by someone who had taken them 10,000 years before. The aerodynamic principle in the Saqqara bird, a model preserved in a priest's tomb because the tradition it represented was dying, because someone knew the knowledge had to survive in some form. The global coordinate network of the Nazca Lines, the last act of a worldwide civilization drawing its own map, marking its own locations, ensuring that when the waters came, something would remain. And beneath the Gulf of Khambhat, the origin point, the source, the library from which all 7 keys were copied, we have examined 7 artifacts, 7 keys. Let us now attempt, carefully, humbly, with full awareness that we are reaching beyond the edges of what can be proven, to read the message they form when placed together. Because they do form a message. It is not encoded in any language we speak. It is not written in text. It is written in the universal language that any sufficiently advanced civilization would inevitably develop and recognize: mathematics. The Ishango bone says, we understood numbers. We understood the abstract structure of numerical relationships, prime numbers, doubling sequences, base systems. We were not counting animals. We were doing mathematics, pure mathematics, the kind that exists for its own sake, that describes the deep structure of reality. The Antikythera mechanism says we understood the cosmos, not as mythology, not as religion, but as a mechanical system, predictable, calculable, governed by laws that can be expressed as gear ratios. We knew where everything was, where it was going, and when it would return. The Baghdad battery says, we understood the invisible. the force that flows between different metals in acid, the electron, the fundamental carrier of electromagnetic interaction. We knew that matter is not inert, that it is active, dynamic, electrical. The Great Pyramid says, we understood the earth. We knew its size, its shape, its axis, its precession. We knew it as a planet, not just as ground to stand on. And we encoded that knowledge in stone so massive that it could survive anything except the deliberate destruction of the stone itself. The Saqqara bird says, we understood air. We understood how shaped objects interact with moving fluid, the principle of lift, the principle of stability, the principle that heavier than air flight is not only possible but achievable with wood and the right geometry. The Nazca lines say, we understood the globe. We had maps. We had coordinate systems. We knew where every place on Earth was relative to every other place. We built a network of sites that spans the planet, connected by geometry, and we marked it in the desert where it could not be erased. And the Gulf of Combat says, we were here. We were real. We built cities. We raised children. We ate meals and argued about mathematics and looked at the stars and wondered, as you wonder, about the nature of existence. We were not gods. We were not aliens. We were human beings. But the message does not end there, because there is one more thing that these 7 artifacts share, one more feature that connects them beyond mathematics, beyond knowledge, beyond technology. They were all preserved deliberately. The Ashango bone was carved in a hard, durable material and was sealed in a cave environment that prevented decay. The Antikythera mechanism sank to the ocean floor in a wreck that kept it in cold, low-oxygen water, the ideal preservation conditions. The Baghdad battery was sealed in an airtight clay container. The Great Pyramid was built from materials that will outlast human civilization. The Saqqara bird was sealed in a tomb. The Nazca lines were placed in the driest, most stable desert environment on Earth. These were not accidents of preservation. These were choices. The people who made these things knew they would be found. Knew that time would pass, enormous amounts of time, and that the world would change, and that a future civilization would eventually develop the tools to understand what they were looking at. They were writing to us, not metaphorically, literally. They selected the most durable media available to them. They placed their messages in locations that would survive catastrophic geological and climatic change. They encoded their knowledge in forms that transcend language and culture, in mathematics, in geometry, in physical demonstration. And then the flood came, and their civilization drowned, and their messages waited for 9,000 years, for 15,000 years, for 20,000 years, in caves and deserts and ocean floors and mountain plateaus, waiting for someone smart enough and humble enough to look. We are that someone, and here is the full weight of that responsibility. If they could preserve knowledge across 20,000 years, if they could anticipate the rise of future civilizations and encode messages for them, if they were sophisticated enough to build the Antikythera mechanism, to calculate pi in stone, to generate electricity, to understand global geography, then they also understood what destroyed them, and they knew it would happen again. The cycle they encoded in the Antikythera mechanism, the cycle of celestial mechanics, of planetary positions, of the slow precession of the equinoxes, is not just a calendar. It is a clock counting down to an event that happens on a geological timescale, an event that has happened before, multiple times, and will happen again. The message encoded in these 7 artifacts is not only "we existed." The message is, "We existed and we were destroyed, and we are telling you what we know so that you do not make our mistakes." Or, and this is the darkest possibility of all, the message is even simpler. "We are warning you. It is coming. Prepare." We began tonight with a letter. A letter buried underground, sealed in a container that should have turned to dust, written in a language no living human speaks. 7 artifacts, 7 keys, 1 message. The question, as we reach the end of this investigation, is not whether the message is real. The evidence, physical, mathematical, geographic, demands that we take the possibility seriously, not as conspiracy, not as fantasy, but as a hypothesis worthy of rigorous scientific investigation. The question is, what do we do with it? For most of recorded history, the answer was nothing. Dismiss it, categorize it, contain it within a narrative that allows the comfortable fiction of linear progress to persist. We are at the pinnacle of human achievement, this narrative says. Everything before us was primitive. Everything before the Greeks was mythology. Everything before writing was silence. But the Ishango bone speaks, and the Antikythera mechanism computes, and the Baghdad battery generates current, and the Great Pyramid encodes the circumference of the earth, and the Saqqara bird flies, and the Nazca lines draw a map of the world, and beneath the Gulf of Khambat, under 40 meters of warm ocean water, a city waits. In 2019, the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities issued a new series of permits for ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Giza Plateau, specifically of the area beneath and around the Sphinx. The results have not been released. In 2021, the Indian Ministry of Earth Sciences announced a planned deep-water investigation of the Gulf of Khambat site. Equipment was procured. Teams were assembled. The mission has not proceeded. In 2023, a team of independent researchers applying AI pattern recognition to satellite imagery of the Nazca Plateau identified 17 new geometric structures that do not correspond to the known Nazca culture's artistic tradition. The findings are under review. Someone does not want this door opened.
That may be simple bureaucratic inertia, the institutional resistance of established science to paradigm-breaking discoveries. That is the charitable interpretation. The less charitable interpretation is that some of what lies behind this door is known, that the chamber beneath the Sphinx, the city beneath the Gulf of Khambat, the full geometric system of the Nazca network, these have been accessed, and what was found there has been deemed by parties with the power to make such decisions too significant to share, too dangerous, too destabilizing, too world-changing, because what this door opens onto is not a room, it is a mirror. If a human civilization existed 20,000 years ago, a civilization with mathematics, with astronomy, with electricity, with global maps, with flight, then what we call the ancient world is not the beginning of human history. It is a fragment of what survived the end. We are not at the pinnacle of human achievement. We are at the beginning of a reconstruction. We are rebuilding, slowly, painfully, remarkably, a fraction of what was understood and known and lived by people who came before us so far back in time that their very existence was reclassified as myth. And if that is true, if the 7 keys unlock the door to that understanding, then everything we think we know about who we are and where we came from needs to be revisited, not discarded.
revisited, with the humility to admit that the official story is incomplete, with the courage to follow the evidence wherever it leads, with the wisdom to understand that knowledge, real knowledge, does not threaten us. It saves us. Let us think for a moment about what it felt like to be one of them. To live in a city on the coast of a warm gulf, perhaps the Gulf of Combat, perhaps another, in a civilization that had mapped the globe, that understood the mathematics of the universe, that had learned to move through the air, that had harnessed the invisible force between metals, to look up at the stars and know precisely, mathematically, where each one would be in 1,000 years, in 10,000 years, in 100,000 years, to understand the cycle, to know the pattern, to see in the data of the precession and the orbital mechanics and the geological record the fingerprints of what had happened before, to know what was coming, and to have the wisdom and the courage and the extraordinary self-sacrificing love for an unimaginable future generation of strangers, to spend your final years not trying to escape, because there was no escaping, but trying to ensure that what you had learned would survive, to carve a bone, to build a mechanism, to seal a battery in clay, to calculate the angles of a pyramid, to place a model in a priest's tomb, to scratch lines in the most protected desert on earth, to build a city so large that its geometric ghost would remain on the seafloor for 10,000 years, waiting for someone with the right instrument to find it. To do all of this, knowing that you would not survive to see if it worked, knowing that you were writing to ghosts who did not yet exist. That is not the behavior of primitive people. That is not the behavior of hunter-gatherers or myth-makers or superstitious worshippers of incomprehensible forces. That is the behavior of scientists, of scholars, of people who understood that knowledge is the most valuable thing that exists, more valuable than gold, more valuable than territory, more valuable than survival itself, because knowledge, once lost, condemns every future generation to relearn what was already known. And they were determined that we would not have to relearn everything. They left us 7 shortcuts, 7 keys. The people who built beneath the Gulf of Combat, who placed the Ishango bone, who drew the Nazca lines, who sealed a model of a flying machine in a priest's tomb. They were not trying to impress us. They were not showing off. They were desperate. The waters were rising. The ice was melting. The coastlines they had mapped for generations were disappearing beneath the sea. Their cities were going under. Their libraries were flooding. Their civilization, everything they had built and understood and passed down for thousands of years, was being erased by forces too large to resist. And so they did the only thing they could. They chose the most durable objects they could find. They encoded the most important knowledge they possessed. They placed their messages in the most protected locations available. And they waited. They did not know who we would be, did not know what language we would speak, what gods we would worship, what we would call ourselves or our civilizations or our era of history. They knew only one thing, that the universe is mathematical, that mathematics is universal, that any intelligence, any civilization, anywhere, at any point in time, that has advanced far enough to ask the question, why, will eventually understand the language of numbers and will eventually find the bones and the mechanisms and the batteries and the pyramids and the birds and the lines and the sunken cities, 7 keys, 1 door, and behind that door, not a tomb, not a treasure vault, not a weapon, a library. the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that loved the universe enough to try to preserve its understanding of it for people it would never meet. For us, we have found the keys, we have read the message. The only question now, the question that these people, watching the waters rise 20,000 years ago, could not answer for us, is this: what will we do with what they left?